She did not cry. That was the thing that would hollow Bartholomew out for the rest of his ruined life. Not the accusations. Not the slamming of doors or the shattered vase he had half-braced himself for. Not even a single, trembling syllable of a woman asking why. None of that came. What came instead was something far more devastating than rage. She simply finished her math. If you love stories where the woman they underestimated becomes the woman they can never reach, you are in the right place. Welcome to Mafia Moonlight Tales. Hit like, drop a comment, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Now let's get into it. The penthouse sat 58 floors above the city, and from this height, Bartholomew Calloway believed the world looked exactly the way it was supposed to, beneath him. Floor-to-ceiling glass stretched across the northern wall of his master's suite like a trophy case, and beyond it, the skyline burned in silver and amber. Glass towers stacked against a moonless sky, a kingdom assembled specifically to flatter the man standing at its center. He was already in bed by 11. He always slept well. Men who feel no guilt always do. Xanthe Adisa-Calloway stood alone in the master's study, and she did not move for a long time. Her champagne satin gown caught the ambient glow of the city through the glass, warm gold pooling across the fabric like something poured, deliberate, luminous against the deep brown of her skin. She looked, as she always had, like a woman built for important rooms. Her natural hair fell in loose waves past her bare shoulders, and her face, the sharp, precise architecture of her cheekbones, the full press of her lips, was entirely composed. Her makeup had not moved. Nothing about her had moved. Even the small, unmistakable curve of her belly, 7 months of life, 7 months of a future she had quietly been constructing, was still beneath the satin. Patient. Present. Certain. Her eyes, dark and deep-set, were not wet with grief. They held the particular gloss of a woman who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally, decided to set it down and walk away from it entirely. She had dressed tonight for an anniversary dinner Bat had cancelled by text at 7:03 p.m. 4 words. Something came up. Rain check. No punctuation. No apology. As if her time were not a resource, but a convenience, available on demand, invisible when inconvenient. She had not cried then, either. 2 hours ago, she had walked into the living room and found them. Bat in his white dinner jacket, still warm from whatever table he had actually chosen to grace that evening, and the woman in silver pressed against his side with the ease of someone who no longer considered consequences. The woman's hand rested on his chest with ownership, not affection, ownership, and her eyes had found Xanthe's across the room with a smile that was not for Bat. It was designed for Xanthe. A performance. A statement dressed in sequins, I am here. And you already know exactly what that means. Bat's jaw had tightened. His eyes widened. His shoulders went rigid. Not with remorse, with the specific, cold irritation of a man who has been seen before he was ready to be seen. And there is a vast and unmistakable difference between a man who is sorry and a man who is merely inconvenienced by being caught. Bartholomew Calloway had never once been sorry for anything in his life. He had, however, frequently been inconvenienced. He had told a colleague at the club 48 hours before this moment, voice rolling with a satisfaction too comfortable to be accidental, she's not going anywhere. Not with a baby on the way. Where would she even go? She needs me. He had actually believed that. He had built his entire empire, every algorithm, every contract structure, every market position that bore his name, on the quiet, unseen architecture of the woman now standing in his study at midnight in a champagne gown, looking at his desk with the focused calm of someone completing the final line of an equation that has already been solved. Xanthe crossed the room. Her footsteps made no sound on the imported marble. She pulled open the mahogany desk drawer and removed a single envelope, thick, cream, the kind reserved for documents that carry legal weight. She had prepared it 4 days ago. Her hand had not trembled then, either. She placed the signed papers at the exact center of his desk with the precision of someone who has spent years making sure everything was exactly right so someone else could take the credit. Then she removed her wedding ring. $800,000 of platinum and oval-cut diamond. 3 years of her life compressed into a circle small enough to disappear inside a closed fist. The ring that had been placed on her finger in front of 400 guests, the ring he had presented to the press as proof that he chose well, married well, as though she were a piece of his portfolio rather than the reason his portfolio existed. She set it at the center of the papers. Aligned it with quiet, final precision, not with grief, but with the deliberate authority of a woman leaving her signature on the last page. She stepped back. She looked at the desk for 3 seconds. Then she lifted the single bag she had packed, one bag, because she had only ever needed what she had built, and she walked out of the life she had constructed for someone else, through the front door, into the night, without once looking back. The rain outside was immediate and cold. It came down in the kind of heavy, certain sheets that soak through satin in seconds and make the city smell like concrete and consequence. Xanthe stood at the base of the private drive, her champagne gown darkening at the hem, her hand resting lightly over her belly, not in fear, but in the quiet assurance of a woman who has already made her decision and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. She did not reach for her phone. She did not call a driver. She stood in the downpour in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she breathed, slowly, fully, for the first time in 3 years. The kind of breath a person takes when the weight they have been bracing under has finally been removed. That was when the headlights came. Not 1. 4, spaced with the kind of geometric precision that does not happen by accident, moving through the rain in absolute, unhurried formation. 4 armored black SUVs, each one gleaming with quiet authority, gliding up the private drive like a sentence that does not need to raise its voice to be taken seriously. They slowed to a stop in front of her. One after another. Engines nearly inaudible beneath the rain. The rear door of the center vehicle opened. He stepped out. Choi Hyun-Bin was not a man who announced himself. He had never needed to. At 41, he carried the kind of presence that rearranged a room's energy before a single word was spoken, the kind built not in gyms or boardrooms, but in years of being the most dangerous and most disciplined man in any space he chose to enter. His black overcoat fell past his knees. His jaw was sharp, clean, utterly relaxed. Jet black hair swept back from his face with effortless precision, catching the cold silver light of the city behind him. He held no umbrella for himself. He had walked through worse things than rain. He moved toward her without hurry, because Choi Hyun-Bin had not been in a hurry about Xanthe Adisa for 3 years. He had been watching. He had read every paper she had quietly authored under her husband's name. He had tracked every algorithm, every market strategy, every structural innovation that had presented to investors as his own singular genius. Hyun-Bin had known the truth long before Xanthe had allowed herself to speak it. He extended the umbrella over her head in one seamless, unhurried motion. His dark eyes found her face and did not move from it. Not with desire. Not with urgency. With recognition. The way a man looks at something rare and precise that he has been waiting, patiently and absolutely, to finally stop watching from a distance. The rain drummed steadily against the umbrella above them. 58 floors up, Bartholomew Calloway slept with the comfortable certainty of a man who believed the world existed on the terms he had set for it. He was already certain she would be back. He had told himself, give her 3 days. The first bill, the first fear, the first morning she woke up without his name protecting her, and she would remember exactly where she belonged. He did not know, could not have known, in the deep and unbothered sleep of a man who had never once been made to reckon with his own limitations, that the woman he had dismissed as an obligation was standing 58 floors below him, in the rain, in a champagne dress, beside the most powerful and most quietly terrifying man in the city. Choi Hyun-Bin looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not softness, exactly. Precision. The arrival of something long calculated finally becoming real. You should have done this sooner, he said. His voice was low, even, iron-sheathed in something darker than silk. Not unkind. Simply true. Xanthe looked at him. Her chin lifted. Her hand rested once, briefly, on the curve of her belly, then stilled. She stepped forward and got into the car. What happens when the man who spent 3 years building a kingdom realizes the architect just walked out the door? Stay with me. This story is only getting started. Like this video. Subscribe to Mafia Moonlight Tales. Drop a comment below, and share this with someone who needs to see what it looks like when a woman finally decides she is the asset. Let's go. 3 hours before she placed her ring on his desk, Xanthe Adisa-Calloway had been the most invisible woman in a room full of people who owed their wealth to her mind. The Calloway Group's annual Investors Gala occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, a cathedral of glass and commissioned art and open bars serving champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week. The guest list was curated. The lighting was architectural. Everything in the room had been selected to communicate one thing, that Bartholomew Calloway was a man of extraordinary taste and even more extraordinary vision. Xanthe had written the pitch deck that convinced the room's most skeptical investors to stay. She had done it in 4 days, between prenatal appointments, while Bat played golf. She stood near the north wall in her champagne gown, one hand resting at her side, the other settled with quiet instinct at the curve of her belly, and she watched the room the way she always watched rooms, with the calm, architectural precision of someone who has already mapped every exit. Around her, Bat's partners moved in clusters of mutual congratulation, glasses raised, voices lifted in the comfortable laughter of men who had never once been uncertain about their own importance. She recognized most of their faces from the decks she had built, the projections she had modeled, the risk assessments she had drafted at 2 in the morning while Bat slept soundly in the next room. None of them looked at her. They rarely did. She had learned, in 3 years of being Bat's wife, that a woman who makes a powerful man look brilliant is almost always made invisible by the very brilliance she provides. It was, she had come to understand, a deliberate architecture. You could not take credit for something if the person who built it was standing next to you, clearly its author. So you kept her quiet. You kept her peripheral. You made sure the room understood the hierarchy before it had time to ask questions. She was reaching for a glass of water when she saw them. Bat stood near the center of the room, his preferred position, always the gravitational point, in his white dinner jacket, laughing at something his CFO had said with the wide, easy laugh of a man who feels entirely, untouchably secure. And beside him, tucked against his side with a familiarity that did not belong to a business acquaintance or a colleague or any of the other explanations Xanthe had quietly rehearsed and discarded over the previous months, was a woman in a silver dress. She was not introduced. She did not need to be. She stood in the precise space, the lean of her shoulder, the placement of her hand on Bat's arm, the particular angle of her chin, that communicated everything a formal introduction would only have confirmed. She was not new. The ease of her was not new. What was new was the fact that she was here, in this room, at this event, which meant Bat had stopped calculating the risk. Which meant he had stopped considering Xanthe a variable worth accounting for. Xanthe did not move. She held her water glass. She kept her face entirely composed. And something shifted in her chest, not breaking, not collapsing, but something more like the final, quiet click of a combination lock that has just completed its sequence. The specific internal sound of a thing becoming irrevocably clear. She had spent 3 years writing contracts, frameworks, and futures, all of them bearing his name. She understood contracts. She understood, with cold and sudden completeness, what it meant when the terms of an agreement had been unilaterally rewritten without her signature. She had been drafting the architecture of her own replacement. She set her glass down on the nearest surface, straightened the front of her gown with one smooth motion, and turned toward the elevator. She had 4 hours of work left to finish. And she had already decided how it would end. The penthouse was exactly as she had left it when she walked back through the front door at 9:30, immaculate, expensive, and entirely indifferent to her presence, the way it had always been. Bat was not home yet. She had not expected him to be. Xanthe moved through the space without turning on any additional lights, navigating by the ambient glow of the city pouring in through the northern glass wall, that cold blue and amber burn of a skyline that never fully darkened, never fully rested. She knew this apartment the way you know a place you designed but never truly owned. Every surface she had selected. Every fixture she had approved. The marble beneath her feet, the art on the walls, the particular shade of white on the ceilings that had taken 3 consultations to finalize. She had built this environment the same way she had built everything else in Bartholomew Calloway's life, with care, with precision, and with her name on none of it. She did not go to the bedroom first. She went to the study. The single bag was already packed. She had placed it beside the mahogany desk 4 days ago, slid neatly against the wall where it would not be noticed, because Bat never noticed anything that wasn't already demanding his attention. One bag. She had stood in her walk-in closet surrounded by 4 years of accumulated luxury and chosen, with the calm efficiency of a woman who has already mentally departed, only what was irreplaceable. Personal documents. Her external hard drives, 3 of them, containing every framework, every proprietary model, every system architecture she had ever built. A photograph of her mother. The small notebook she had carried since graduate school, its margins dense with equations and ideas, and the careful record of a mind that had been working, always working, long before Bat had thought to put a ring on it. Everything else was furniture. She left it where it stood. She sat down at the desk and opened the cream envelope she had sealed 4 days prior. She did not read it again. She had read it enough. The language was precise, clean, and entirely fair. She had made sure of that, because Xanthe Adisa did not do anything carelessly, not even the ending of a marriage. She placed the papers at the center of the desk with the deliberate alignment of someone who understands that the final impression of an act matters as much as the act itself. Then she removed her wedding ring. She held it for a moment in the low light, not with sentiment, but with the quiet, honest acknowledgement that it deserved. $800,000. 3 years. A promise made in front of people who had applauded and raised their glasses and said, with genuine warmth, what a remarkable pair. What they had meant, without knowing they meant it, was, what a remarkable woman, standing beside a man who will spend the next 3 years making sure no one else knows it. She set the ring at the center of the papers. Aligned it. Stepped back. Looked at the desk for 3 seconds. And walked out. The hallway. The elevator. The lobby, where the night doorman looked up from his desk and then looked quickly away, the way people look away from things they sense are significant and private and none of their business. The front entrance. And then the cold, and the rain, and the immediate, soaking certainty of the night pressing against the champagne satin of her gown. She stood at the base of the drive and did not reach for her phone. Her hand found her belly instead, the firm, warm, impossible reality of the life she was already protecting, already walking toward a future worthy of what it deserved. She breathed in. Slowly. Fully. For the first time in 3 years, the air tasted like it belonged to her. He did not ask if she was all right. That was the first thing she noticed about Choi Hyun-Bin, the thing that would stay with her long after the rain had dried from her gown and the night had folded itself into memory. He looked at her standing in the downpour, 7 months pregnant, champagne satin darkened at the hem, and he did not arrange his face into the particular expression people reserved for women they had decided were fragile. There was no performance of concern. No careful, condescending softness. He simply looked at her the way she had always wanted to be looked at, as someone fully capable of having made exactly the decision she had just made. The umbrella was already extended over her head before she had time to register that he had moved. Xanthe had known Choi Hyun-Bin existed the way you know that weather systems exist over oceans you have never visited, as something vast and consequential and operating entirely beyond the boundaries of your daily life. She knew his name because the financial world whispered it in the specific register reserved for men whose influence exceeded what balance sheets could fully capture. She knew his face because he had appeared, twice, at industry summits where Bat had presented work that was hers, and both times she had caught him watching, not the presentation, not the slides, not Bat's practiced, polished delivery. He had been watching her. The subtle correction of a figure she made with her expression when Bat misquoted a projection. The single, almost imperceptible tightening at her jaw when an investor asked a structural question Bat fumbled and she was not permitted to answer. Hyun-Bin had noticed everything. She understood that now. His dark eyes moved across her face with the unhurried attention of a man who has already done the analysis and is now simply confirming what he knows. The rain drummed steadily above them. Neither of them spoke for a moment, not because there was nothing to say, but because some understandings are large enough that language needs a moment to properly enter them. "I have a research facility," he said. His voice was low, even, carrying the particular calm of a man who does not raise it because he has never needed to. "In Seoul and here. Fully resourced. Independent infrastructure. Your name on the door, your terms on the contract, your work belonging entirely and legally to you." He paused for exactly 1 beat. "I have been holding the position open for 14 months. Xanthe looked at him steadily. The rain continued. "You've been waiting." "I've been waiting," he confirmed, without apology or elaboration, as though patience of that magnitude were simply a reasonable response to recognizing something worth waiting for. She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the 4 black SUVs idled in perfect formation, their engines barely audible, their headlights cutting clean geometry through the falling rain. There was no urgency in any of it. No pressure. Just the quiet, absolute readiness of a man and an infrastructure that had already decided, long before tonight, exactly what it was prepared to offer. I have conditions, Xanthe said. I would expect nothing less. Full intellectual property ownership. Autonomous operational authority. And nothing, her voice did not waver, moves through my work without my direct authorization. Not your name. Not your organization. Not anyone. Hyun-Bin held her gaze. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise. Something closer to satisfaction, the specific, quiet kind that belongs to a man who has just had a long-held theory confirmed by evidence. Those were already written into the contract, he said. I had my lawyers draft it to your known preferences. You can review it tonight if you choose. Xanthe was still for one long moment. Her hand rested at her belly. Her chin lifted. This was not rescue. She understood that clearly, and the understanding settled into her chest like something solid and permanent. This was an alliance between two people who each recognized, with precision, exactly what the other was worth. She stepped forward and got into the car. Bartholomew Calloway woke at 7:43 with the easy, unhurried consciousness of a man who had never once opened his eyes into uncertainty. He lay still for a moment in the gray morning light, one arm folded behind his head, staring at the ceiling with the comfortable blankness of someone whose first thought upon waking was never did I do something wrong but always, reflexively, what do I need today? The rain had stopped sometime before dawn. The city beyond the glass wall was doing what it always did, continuing, indifferently, without waiting for his permission. He found this privately satisfying. Order. Predictability. Everything in its correct place. He reached across the bed without looking. The other side was cold and undisturbed. He registered this the way you register a change in ambient temperature, as a physical fact, stripped of meaning until meaning was consciously assigned to it. He lay there for another moment, then swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached for his phone. 14 messages. 3 from his CFO, which he ignored. 1 from the woman in silver, which he opened first. He read it with the small, private smile of a man conducting his life exactly as he intended to conduct it. He typed a reply, set the phone face down on the nightstand, and stood. He found the ring at 8:15. He had walked into the study to retrieve a document from his desk, something routine, something forgettable, and he saw the cream envelope first. Thick. Centered. Placed with a precision that stopped him in the doorway for exactly 1 second before his brain assigned it its correct category. His eyes moved to the ring sitting at the envelope center, catching the flat morning light with the dull, indifferent gleam of a thing that no longer belonged to anyone. Bartholomew Calloway looked at his wife's wedding ring on top of his desk. And then he laughed. It came out fully, genuinely, the deep, rolling laugh of a man who has just received news that confirms everything he already believed about the world and his position within it. He picked the ring up, turned it once between his fingers, and set it back down with the casual dismissal of a man replacing a decorative object that had been moved out of alignment. He called her an hour later. Standing in his kitchen in his robe, coffee in hand, looking out at the skyline with the proprietary satisfaction of a man surveying his assets. The call went to voicemail on the third ring. He was not surprised. He was not concerned. He left no message because he did not believe one was necessary. By 10 o'clock, the woman in silver was sitting across from him at his kitchen island, one leg crossed, watching him over the rim of her coffee cup with an expression that was equal parts amusement and appetite. She'll be back, Bat said, for the second time in as many minutes. He said it the way people state facts they consider too obvious to require supporting evidence. She has nowhere to go. No independent accounts, no separate infrastructure, nothing set up in her name. He set his cup down. The baby changes everything. First medical bill, first insurance question, first moment she realizes that being principled doesn't cover a hospital stay, she'll call. The woman in silver smiled in the way she always smiled, with the precise portion of her face that communicated agreement without requiring her to fully commit to it. And if she doesn't, she asked, lightly, more performance than genuine inquiry. Bat picked up his phone and opened his messages with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never lost anything he decided to keep. She will, he said simply. She needs me. She always has. He believed this completely. He believed it the way a man believes in the structural integrity of a building he has never once inspected, because it had always held before, and he had never had reason to look at what was actually holding it up. The first error appeared on a Tuesday. It surfaced in the risk modeling layer of the Calloway Group's primary investment algorithm, a cascading miscalculation that flagged 17 active portfolio positions as simultaneously overleveraged, triggering an automated rebalancing sequence that should not have been possible to trigger, because Xanthe had built a containment protocol specifically to prevent it. The protocol, his systems team would discover 4 hours too late, required a quarterly recalibration input that only one person had ever performed. That person had left a ring on a mahogany desk 11 days prior and had not been back. Bat was in a lunch meeting when his CFO called. He stepped into the hallway, listened for 90 seconds, and returned to the table with the composed expression of a man who has decided, in real time, that a thing is smaller than it is. Systems issue, he told his guests, with a wave of his hand that communicated the matter was already beneath his attention. My team handles it. His team did not handle it. By Thursday, 3 consulting firms had been brought in. By the following Monday, 2 of them had quietly withdrawn, citing the system's complexity as beyond their current scope, language that translated, in practice, to, we have never seen architecture like this and we cannot work on what we cannot fully map. The third firm's lead analyst asked, during a tense Friday afternoon session with Bat's executive team, who had originally designed the integrated forecasting model. There was a pause around the conference table, the specific, uncomfortable pause of a room full of people who know an answer no one wants to say out loud. Bat's CTO cleared his throat. It was developed in-house, he said carefully. By whom? Another pause. Longer this time. Bat arrived at the office on the 3rd week to find his head of operations waiting outside his door with a tablet and an expression that belonged on a man delivering a medical diagnosis. The overnight processing cycle had failed to complete. 14 client reports had generated corrupted outputs. 2 institutional investors had called before 9 in the morning, and neither call had been friendly. He sat at his desk and pulled up the system architecture files for the first time, truly pulled them up, opened them, attempted to read them, and sat in silence for a long time. The files were extraordinary. Layered and interlocking and built with the kind of structural elegance that didn't announce itself but revealed itself gradually, the deeper you looked, like a cathedral that appears simple from the street and opens into something breathtaking the moment you step inside. He scrolled through framework after framework, each one referencing and reinforcing the others, a living, interdependent system that had been quietly generating the accuracy and speed and reliability that his investors had come to expect as simply the nature of working with the Calloway Group. He had never built a single line of it. He had presented it. He had stood in rooms and accepted the specific praise that belongs to visionaries and innovators and men of singular intelligence, and he had accepted it without a syllable of correction, because the woman who built it had never once demanded the credit. She had never demanded anything. She had simply worked, and trusted, and built, and waited, with the patience of someone who believed that loyalty, applied with enough consistency, would eventually produce what it deserved. He sat back in his chair. The skyline was doing its indifferent thing beyond the glass, towers of light stacked against a pale afternoon sky, entirely unbothered by the slow, systematic unwinding happening on the 52nd floor of the Meridian building. He thought about the ring on the desk. The cream envelope. The single bag she had packed. He had laughed. The understanding arrived not as a lightning strike but as something colder and more thorough, a slow flood rising from the ground up, filling every room before he had time to close a single door. He had not lost a wife. He had lost the entire architecture of everything he had claimed to build. The board meeting lasted 2 hours and 19 minutes, and it was the longest 2 hours and 19 minutes of Bartholomew Calloway's professional life. There were 11 people around the table. Men and women who had each written substantial checks based on the consistent, almost implausible accuracy of the Calloway Group's forecasting models. They had not come to ask questions so much as to ask one question, repeatedly, in different configurations, until they received an answer that satisfied them. The question was simple: what is happening to our returns, and when will it stop? Bat answered with the fluency of a man who had spent a decade performing competence in rooms that rewarded performance over substance. He used the correct language. He projected the correct calibration of concern, enough to signal that he took the matter seriously, not enough to suggest it was beyond his control. He committed to a remediation timeline. He referenced the consulting engagement. He said the phrase systemic recalibration 4 times, because it sounded like something that had a solution. When the last board member filed out, his CFO closed the door and looked at him across the empty table with the expression of a man who has decided that honesty is now the only remaining option. "We need her back," he said. Plainly. Without architecture. Bat straightened his jacket. "That's not a conversation we're having. Bartholomew." His CFO almost never used his full name. "I have been with this company for 6 years. I have watched every model, every framework, every system that made us competitive get built by one person. I know whose work that was. The consultants know. The board is beginning to suspect." He set both hands flat on the table. "We need her back, or we need to tell me what she left behind that I can actually use." Bat said nothing for a long moment. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. He made the call that afternoon. A private firm, the kind that did not advertise, the kind whose number moved through certain circles the way a good attorney's name moved, by quiet and specific referral. He had used them twice before for due diligence work. He explained what he needed with the brisk efficiency of a man placing an order he considered routine. Find her. Current location. Current situation. Full report. He did not say her name with concern. He said it with the particular flatness of a man reclassifying a person as a problem to be located and retrieved. In his mind, the narrative had already arranged itself into the shape most comfortable for him, Xanthe, somewhere in the city, in circumstances that had by now confirmed every prediction he had made the morning he found the ring. A woman, 7 months pregnant, no independent accounts, no separate professional standing, no network of her own that he had ever been required to acknowledge. The math was simple. The math was obvious. She would be struggling, and struggling people came back when the alternative became concrete enough. He told his mistress as much that evening. She listened with the careful attention of a woman who had learned to agree with him as a matter of operating practice. She did not point out that she had never, in all the months she had known Bartholomew, heard him once describe his wife as a woman without resources. She did not point out that a woman who could build what Xanthe had built was not, by any reasonable assessment, a woman without options. She said nothing, because saying nothing was the arrangement, and the arrangement was comfortable, and comfort had its own particular form of blindness. The investigator's first preliminary report arrived 4 days later. Bat opened it at his desk, in the study where the ring had sat, where the cream envelope had sat, where the absence of both things had slowly begun to feel less like freedom and more like a room with a missing wall. He read the first 2 lines. He read them again. His jaw tightened, not with the inconvenience of being caught this time, but with something he had not felt in long enough that it took him a full moment to correctly identify it. It was the specific, unwelcome cold of a man who has just realized he badly miscalculated. The investigator's report had contained 2 lines that mattered. The first, subject is not in financial distress. Current residential and professional situation indicates significant resource access. The second was a location, a single address, cross-referenced with an event listing that Bat recognized immediately, because he had been trying to secure an invitation to it for 3 consecutive years and had been declined, each time, with the polished indifference of people who did not need his money badly enough to pretend they wanted his company. The Obsidian Gala. 40 guests. The kind of event that did not appear in social columns because the people who attended it did not require that form of validation. It was, in the specific taxonomy of wealth and influence that Bat had spent his entire career attempting to fully penetrate, the room he had never quite been allowed inside. He arrived without an invitation at 9:47, which meant he arrived on the momentum of desperation dressed as confidence, the most dangerous and most transparent combination a man could walk through a door wearing. His name moved through 2 assistants before someone with the appropriate authority materialized to explain, with exquisite courtesy, that the evening was closed. Bat said his name again, with the additional weight of his company's name behind it, and watched the almost imperceptible flicker of something cross the man's expression, not recognition of power, but recognition of a situation requiring management. He was allowed to the threshold of the main room. No further. It was enough. The space was everything his events aspired to be and never fully achieved, low, expensive light falling across a room of people who were their influence the way old buildings were their age, as something structural rather than decorative. No performance of wealth. No anxiety underneath the surface of things. Just the deep, settled quiet of a room where everyone present had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He found her in 11 seconds. She was standing near the far window, the city burning gold and silver behind her, and she was wearing champagne, the same color she had worn the night she walked out, as though she had decided that the aesthetic of her exit was worth keeping. But the gown was different. It had been made for this version of her, fitted and luminous, moving with the particular authority of something custom constructed for exactly this body, this posture, this woman. Her hair was swept up, and the line of her neck and shoulders caught the light with an elegance so precise it did not look assembled. It looked inevitable. She was not struggling. She was not diminished. She was not the version of her that Bat had constructed in the comfortable story he had been telling himself for 6 weeks. She was, by every visible measure, more herself than he had ever seen her, as though the life she had been living inside his shadow had been a compression, and she had simply expanded back to her actual dimensions the moment she stepped out of it. She was also, unmistakably, 7 months further along than the night she left, and she carried the fact of her pregnancy with the same composure she carried everything, not as vulnerability, but as evidence of a future already in progress. Beside her stood Choi Hyun-Bin. Bat knew the name. Everyone in the room knew the name. Hyun-Bin stood with the relaxed, total authority of a man who did not need the room to look at him because the room was already oriented around him, the way a space orients around its own load-bearing wall. He was speaking to someone to his left, but his hand, easy, unhurried, entirely certain, rested at the small of Xanthe's back with the quiet permanence of something that had already been decided. As though she had always been exactly where she was standing. As though the only thing that had changed was that the rest of the world was only now being permitted to see it. Bat stood at the threshold of the room he had never been allowed to enter, and felt the specific, nauseating vertigo of a man watching the precise moment his miscalculation becomes irreversible. He should not have crossed the room. Every functioning instinct he had left should have told him that. But Bartholomew Calloway had built his entire life on the belief that presence was leverage, that showing up with enough certainty could restructure any situation in his favor, and that belief had survived long enough to become indistinguishable from reflex. He crossed the room. He moved through the perimeter of the gala with the focused, slightly too deliberate stride of a man who has committed to an action before fully thinking it through and is now relying on momentum to carry him past the point of reconsideration. People noticed him. Not with the recognition he was accustomed to, but with the particular attention a room gives to something that does not belong in it, a brief, assessing glance, and then the careful repositioning of bodies that creates a corridor without anyone acknowledging they have made one. Xanthe saw him when he was 12 feet away. He watched her see him, watched her eyes register his approach, watched her face do absolutely nothing in response. No alarm. No bracing. The expression of a woman who has already calculated this possibility and filed it under manageable. He stopped in front of her. "We need to talk," he said. He had intended it to land as authority. It landed as request. Xanthe looked at him with the calm, level attention she might give a quarterly report she had already read. "Bartholomew," she said, by way of acknowledgement. Nothing more. Hyun-Bin had not turned immediately. He finished the sentence he was delivering to the person on his left, with the unhurried completeness of a man who declines to be rushed by things he does not consider urgent. Then he turned, and his dark eyes settled on Bat with an expression of such absolute, measured stillness that it took Bat a full moment to understand that he was not being assessed. He had already been assessed. This was simply the part where the conclusion was being observed. "The baby," Bat said, pivoting, dropping his voice to the register he used for negotiations where he wanted to imply intimacy as leverage. "Whatever you think you're doing, there are obligations here. Legal ones. You can't simply." "The intellectual property filings were completed 31 days ago," Xanthe said. Her voice was quiet, precise, and utterly without heat. "Every framework, every model, every proprietary system I built during our marriage has been legally established under my name. The documentation was submitted the same night I left." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "You were served 2 weeks ago. I assumed your legal team told you." The blood moved differently in Bat's face. Something behind his eyes shifted, the specific, internal rearrangement of a man whose strategy has just lost its foundation mid-execution. Hyun-Bin spoke then. Quietly, the way a person speaks when they want to make sure every word lands in exactly the right place. "6 of your former institutional clients have restructured their investment agreements in the last 3 weeks," he said. "They are now working directly with Dr. Adisa's firm. 3 more have inquiries pending." He paused, with the patience of a man who has always had time on his side. The market, it turns out, was loyal to the work. Not to the name attached to it. Bat opened his mouth. Your dead instruments were acquired this morning, Hyun-Bin continued, as though Bat had not moved at all. All of them. The full portfolio. At face value, which was, given current circumstances, generous. His jaw remained relaxed. His voice remained level. I thought it was a reasonable wedding gift. The room was very quiet around them. Bat stood at the center of the life he believed he had built, and felt every wall of it become, in a single moment, someone else's structure entirely. He had nothing left to use. No obligation. No leverage. No story in which he was still the necessary party. Xanthe looked at him one final time, not with triumph, not with grief, with the clean, settled finality of a woman who has closed the last outstanding account and found the balance exactly where she calculated it would be. Goodbye, Bartholomew, she said. For 3 seconds, Bat did not move. He stood in the precise center of the room's attention, because the room was watching now, with the discreet, total awareness of people who have been trained by years of high-stakes environments to absorb everything while appearing to observe nothing, and he had the specific, hollow look of a man whose internal architecture has just been condemned. Everything he had walked in with, the momentum, the manufactured certainty, the reflexive belief that his presence alone could restructure a situation in his favor, had vacated him completely, leaving only the outline of the performance behind. Then he reached for Xanthe's arm. It was the decision of a man who has run out of language and reverted to the only remaining instrument he believed he still controlled. His hand closed around her wrist with the pressured, possessive grip of someone attempting to physically reclaim a narrative that had already concluded without him. He did not hold it for long. The two men who materialized from the room's perimeter moved with the quiet, efficient precision of people who had been watching the entire approach and had simply been waiting for the moment that required them. They did not rush. They did not raise their voices. They repositioned Bat away from Xanthe with the firm, seamless authority of a system removing an error, not dramatically, not cruelly, but with the complete and unambiguous finality of a door being closed on something that no longer had access. Bat said her name once, as they guided him toward the exit. Then he said it again, with more pressure behind it, as though volume might restore what leverage could not. The room continued its conversation around him the way water continues around something removed from it, closing over the space immediately, leaving no evidence that the disruption had occurred. The door closed. The room breathed. Xanthe stood exactly where she had been standing throughout the entirety of it, composed, still, her hand resting at her belly with the quiet, grounded certainty that had characterized every significant moment of the past 6 weeks. She had not stepped back. She had not looked away. She had simply remained herself, which was, she had come to understand, the most structurally sound position she had ever occupied. Hyun-Bin turned to her. The stillness in his expression had shifted into something she was only beginning to learn to read, not softness, precisely, but the specific quality of a controlled man allowing something true to surface in the presence of someone he has decided is worth the honesty. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, the way he often did, with the unhurried attention of a man who has never once confused silence for absence of meaning. Then he took her hand. He brought it to his lips with the deliberate, unperformed grace of a gesture that did not require an audience but did not diminish for having one. His dark eyes held hers throughout, steady, certain, carrying the full weight of 14 months of patience and the specific, absolute clarity of a man who has known what he wanted long enough that the wanting has become simply the truth of him. The room had quieted in the way rooms quiet when something real is happening inside them. Ladies and gentlemen. His voice was low and carried without effort to every corner of the space. I would like to introduce Dr. Xanthe Adisa, founder and chief architect of Adisa Systems, whose first institutional partnership launches next quarter. He paused, and something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the precise geography of one. And the future Mrs. Choi. The room responded the way rooms of that caliber respond to things they recognize as significant, not with noise, but with the particular, weighted attention of people recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the evening. Xanthe looked at Hyun-Bin. At the steadiness of him. At the complete, unqualified certainty in his expression, the face of a man offering not rescue, not possession, but partnership between two people who had each, independently, already decided they were worth more than what they had previously been given. Her chin lifted. Her shoulders settled. And for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, Xanthe Adisa smiled with the full, unheld brightness of a woman who has finally, completely, arrived at the life her brilliance always deserved. 6 months later, Xanthe Adisa-Calloway sat in the corner office of the Adisa Systems headquarters and watched the city do its indifferent, continuous thing beyond the glass. The office was on the 31st floor. She had chosen it not for the height but for the light, the way the afternoon sun came through the eastern wall at a specific angle that made the room feel less like a place of business and more like a place of becoming. There was a photograph on her desk. Not of a wedding, not of a gala, not of any of the evenings that the world would eventually construct into a story about her. It was a photograph of her mother, taken 20 years ago in a kitchen that smelled like groundnut soup and certainty, looking at the camera with the particular expression of a woman who had already decided, long before the world confirmed it, that she was worth every room she chose to enter. Xanthe had looked at that photograph on the night she packed her single bag. She had looked at it again the morning she signed the Adisa Systems Incorporation documents, her daughter asleep in the bassinet 3 feet away, brand new and entirely certain of her own importance in the way that only the very new and the very wise ever truly are. She thought about loyalty often, in the way you think about something you once misunderstood and have since corrected at considerable cost. She had given hers to a man who received it as infrastructure, something load-bearing and invisible, valuable only in its reliable presence and never once in its origin. She understood now what her mother had tried to tell her years before she was ready to hear it, that loyalty offered without reciprocity is not nobility. It is a slow and voluntary diminishment. It is a gift delivered repeatedly to a person who has never once asked where it comes from or what it costs the person carrying it. Loyalty is not a debt. It was never a debt. It is a gift, and like all gifts of genuine worth, it belongs only where it is recognized. She thought about the ring sometimes, not with grief, but with the clean, educational clarity of a woman examining a decision she will not repeat. $800,000 of platinum and diamond, set at the center of a desk, returned with the precision of someone who understands that value is not diminished by being unrecognized. A diamond does not become lesser because the person holding it lacks the knowledge to understand what they have. It remains what it is, entirely, structurally, permanently, regardless of the quality of the observer. Brilliance operates the same way. She knew that now with the kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than only in the mind, the kind that does not require revisiting because it has been fully absorbed. She had not waited for Bartholomew Calloway to recognize what she was worth. She had simply ensured, with the quiet, thorough preparation of a woman who had spent years building systems, that her value was legally, professionally, and permanently her own before she walked out the door. The files had been backed up long before the exit. The intellectual property had been documented. The exit had been architecturally sound because she had designed it the same way she designed everything, with full structural integrity, zero dependence on the cooperation of the person who had failed to deserve her, and every essential thing already secured before the first visible move was made. That was the nature of real power. It did not announce itself. It did not require an audience or a confrontation or the satisfaction of being witnessed in its execution. It simply ensured that when the moment arrived, everything necessary was already in place. She heard the door open behind her and turned. Hyun-Bin stood in the doorway with their daughter against his chest, 3 months old and regarding the world with the focused, assessing calm of someone who has inherited 2 very formidable minds and is already taking inventory. His expression, as it always was when he held her, carried that rare and specific quality of a controlled man entirely undone by something he would not trade for anything the world had previously offered him. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, the 3 of them looking out at the city together, the skyline burning in the late afternoon light the way it always burned, indifferent to everything except the simple, continuous fact of its own existence. Xanthe looked at the life she had built on her own terms, with her own name on the door, and felt the deep, structural satisfaction of a woman who had finally, completely, and permanently arrived. She had not needed saving. She had needed space. And she had made it herself.